Ma'am, I need you to step back from the counter. The gate agent's voice cut through the terminal noise, sharp enough that 3 people in line turned to look. Elijah Carter stood at the boarding counter with his 6-year-old son, Micah, gripping the strap of his backpack. And he had not raised his voice, had not moved suddenly, had done nothing except hand over a boarding pass and a passport. The agent, a young woman with a name tag that read Jessica, looked at the documents, looked at Elijah's faded flight jacket and worn duffel bag, and looked at him the way people look at something they have already decided does not belong. "Sir, this ticket was flagged for additional verification," she said. "I'm going to need you to wait to the side while I sort this out." Nobody else in that line had been flagged. Nobody else had been asked to step aside. Elijah understood what was happening within the first 4 seconds, and understood something else too. Arguing about it in front of his son at 7 in the morning was not a fight worth starting yet. He picked up his duffel bag, took Micah's hand, and stepped to the side, exactly as told. What happened over the next 40 minutes would end with a woman in a $5,000 coat threatening to have him removed from the airport, a gate supervisor going pale at the sight of a tattoo on his forearm, and an entire terminal falling silent around a man nobody had bothered to actually see. If stories like this keep you watching, subscribe, because there is more coming. Elijah Carter had learned, a long time ago, that mornings were the only part of the day he could fully control, and he guarded them accordingly. Up at 5, coffee brewing in the dark, and by 5:30, he was in Micah's room easing the boy awake, with the same 3 words he used every day. "Time to fly, buddy." Micah, who thought airplanes were the single greatest invention in human history, never needed to be told twice. He dressed himself in under 4 minutes, a personal record he mentioned constantly, and appeared in the kitchen wearing whichever shirt had a plane on it that week. This week it was a faded gray one with a cartoon jet circling a cloud, a shirt his mother had bought him before she passed, 2 years ago, from complications that had arrived faster than anyone expected, and left a hole in the apartment Elijah had spent every day since trying to fill. He was 38, built like a man who still trained even when nobody was watching, with a quiet economy of movement that made him seem taller than he was. He worked as an aircraft mechanic for a regional maintenance contractor, 6 days a week when the schedule demanded it, and had raised Micah alone since the funeral. Twice a year, when the money stretched far enough, he took Micah on a trip. This morning, they were flying to see Elijah's mother in Ohio for her 75th birthday, a trip Micah had been counting down for 3 weeks on a paper calendar taped to his bedroom wall. Elijah did not look wealthy. He never had. He wore what fit and what lasted, and the flight jacket he had on this morning was the same one he had owned for 9 years, its left sleeve carrying a small embroidered patch that most people never noticed. He had learned, in the years since leaving the service, that the way people treated him changed depending on what he wore and how he carried himself, and that correcting every misjudgment along the way cost more than it was worth. So he mostly let it go. Most mornings, there was no battle at all, just a father and a son moving through the world together, unremarkable and unbothered. The airport that morning was busy in the particular way that early flights always were, a current of tired travelers moving in the same general direction with the same low-grade urgency. Elijah checked his bag, got Micah a hot chocolate from the kiosk near security, and made it through the checkpoint with 50 minutes to spare, which for a man traveling with a 6-year-old felt like abundance. Micah spent the walk to the gate narrating every aircraft visible through the windows with the confident authority of someone who had absorbed an entire library of aviation facts from a single book his father had given him for his 6th birthday. "That's a 737, Micah announced, pointing at a plane taxiing past the window. "Dad, is ours a 737? Elijah told him he'd find out at the gate, which Micah accepted as a reasonable answer, The way he accepted most things his father told him, with the total unquestioning trust of a child who had never once been given a reason to doubt him. They reached the gate with time to spare, found seats near the window, and Elijah pulled a granola bar out of his bag for Micah while he checked his phone for the boarding time. It was an ordinary morning in every way that mattered, right up until it wasn't. The trouble started the moment Elijah stepped up to the counter to pre-board with Micah, a courtesy the airline extended to families with young children, which he had used without incident on every previous trip. Jessica, the gate agent, scanned his boarding pass, and the screen in front of her produced a small red flag that made her pause. Elijah watched her expression shift, the same recalibration he had seen more times than he could count over the years, a subtle narrowing that had nothing to do with the screen and everything to do with the man standing in front of it. She looked at him again, longer this time, taking in the duffel bag, the jacket, the boy holding his hand, and something in her posture straightened into a kind of manufactured formality. "Sir, this ticket has been flagged for additional verification," she said, loud enough that the people in line behind him could hear it clearly. "I'm going to need to see a secondary form of identification." Elijah had never been asked for secondary identification on a domestic flight in his life, and he suspected, correctly, that the flag on the screen had considerably less to do with any actual security protocol than it did with an algorithm nobody could see, making a judgment nobody could challenge, filtered through a person who had already decided what kind of man was standing in front of her. He handed over his driver's license without argument. Jessica looked at it, looked at him, and set it down on the counter instead of handing it back. "I'm going to need you to step to the side while I get this sorted out," she said. "This might take a few minutes." Nobody else in that line was asked to step aside. Elijah watched 3 more passengers board in the time it took Jessica to make a phone call that seemed to accomplish very little, beyond keeping him standing at the edge of the gate area with his son's hand in his. Micah, watching the interaction with the careful attention of a child who understood more than he had words for, tugged gently on his father's sleeve. "Dad, why can't we get on the plane?" Elijah crouched down to his level, kept his voice even and warm, the voice he used specifically to keep the world's disorder from becoming his son's problem. "We're just waiting on some paperwork, buddy," he said. "Nothing to worry about." Micah nodded, mostly convinced, and went back to watching the tarmac through the window, though every few seconds his eyes drifted back toward his father's face, checking for something that would tell him whether the reassurance was true. It was at that moment that Diane Whitmore approached the counter, and everything about the way she moved suggested a woman who had never once waited for anything without being deeply irritated by the experience. She was in her 50s, dressed in a cream-colored coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, trailing a monogram carry-on a porter had wheeled to the gate for her before disappearing. She was the regional director of a logistics company holding an advertising contract with the airline, a fact she mentioned within 90 seconds of any interaction that did not go her way, and this morning was shaping up to be exactly that kind. She had been placed in a middle seat due to a system error, and she wanted it fixed immediately, and she wanted everyone nearby to understand the scale of her inconvenience. Jessica, still dealing with Elijah's paperwork, asked her to wait one moment. Diane did not wait. She turned, took in the scene at the side of the counter, Elijah standing quietly with his son, his identification sitting untouched, and something about the picture seemed to offend her on a level she did not bother to examine. "Is this what's holding up the line?" she said, pitched for the benefit of anyone listening. "Some kind of problem with his ticket." Jessica, flustered, mentioned a verification flag. Diane looked at Elijah directly for the first time, at the duffel bag, the jacket, the boy, and drew a conclusion in under 2 seconds she would spend the rest of the morning refusing to reconsider. "Well," she said, loudly enough to carry, "I suppose that explains itself." Elijah did not respond immediately. He had spent a long time learning the difference between an insult worth answering and one better absorbed for the sake of the people around him, who had no stake in his dignity being defended in a crowded gate area at 7 in the morning. He simply looked at her, said nothing, and turned his attention back to Micah, who had gone very still beside him, his small hand tightening around his father's fingers. Diane, unaccustomed to being ignored, seemed to find the silence more provoking than any response could have been. "I travel this route every week," she said, addressing Jessica now, but keeping her eyes on Elijah. "And I have never seen this kind of delay for a family that actually belongs in this boarding group. Perhaps a closer look is warranted." A few people in the nearby seats looked up from their phones, sensing the tone of the morning had shifted into something they needed to pay attention to. Micah looked up at his father with the same open, searching expression Elijah had seen on his own face, in old photographs from a childhood spent absorbing indignities he had not yet had the vocabulary to name. "Dad," he asked quietly, "not really meant for anyone but Elijah. Why does she keep looking at us like that?" Elijah crouched down again, kept his voice low and steady. "Some people look at things and decide they understand them before they actually do," he said. "That's a mistake they're making, not a truth about us." Micah considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things his father told him, and nodded, though his eyes drifted back toward Diane with the wary caution of a child cataloging a threat. Diane, meanwhile, had pulled out her phone and was speaking to someone in a brisk, businesslike tone that made clear she was not asking for help so much as issuing an update. Elijah caught fragments of it. The words delay and unacceptable, and "I'll be speaking to someone about this at the corporate level," and understood that whatever storm was building was not going to resolve itself quietly. Jessica returned to the counter. The phone call about Elijah's verification apparently concluded, and there was a new tightness in her expression that suggested the conversation had not gone the way she expected. "Sir," she said, "I'm going to need you to come with me to speak with my supervisor." Elijah asked calmly whether there was a specific problem with his identification or his ticket that needed to be resolved. Jessica did not answer the question directly. "It's just a formality," she said, in the tone of someone repeating a phrase she had been given rather than one she had chosen herself. He picked up Micah's backpack, took his son's hand, and followed her toward a small office near the gate, aware of the eyes tracking him across the terminal, aware of the particular kind of attention that follows a man being escorted somewhere by airport staff, an attention that assumes guilt before any evidence has been presented. Diane, apparently unwilling to let the matter rest without further commentary, fell into step a few paces behind them, phone still pressed to her ear, narrating the unfolding situation to whoever was on the other end of the line with the satisfied energy of someone whose worldview had just been confirmed. The supervisor's office was small and windowless, and the man behind the desk introduced himself as Gary Pruitt, Gate Operations Manager. He gestured for Elijah to sit, did not offer the same courtesy to Micah, who ended up perched on his father's knee, and pulled up something on his computer screen that he studied with theatrical concern. "There's an inconsistency in your travel history," Pruitt said, "that our system flagged automatically. I need to ask you a few questions before I can clear you for boarding." Elijah asked what specifically had been flagged. Pruitt did not answer directly, and instead asked where he was traveling, why, how long he intended to stay, and whether anyone could verify his relationship to the child sitting on his knee. The question landed with a particular ugliness, Elijah felt, before he processed it fully. "He is my son," Elijah said, his voice completely level. "I have his birth certificate in my bag, if you need to see it. Though I'd ask you to consider why you're asking me that, and whether you'd ask it of every other father at this gate this morning." Pruitt did not answer that either. Through the office's interior window, Elijah could see Diane still on her phone outside, occasionally glancing in with an expression suggesting she considered this whole process a personal vindication rather than the humiliation it actually was. Micah, sitting on his father's knee, had gone quiet in the way children go quiet when they sense the adults around them are not being honest, and pressed closer to his father's chest, one small fist curling into the fabric of his jacket. "Sir," Pruitt said, after several more minutes of questions that led nowhere and clarified nothing, "I'm going to have to hold your boarding pass while this gets reviewed further. Your flight is boarding in 12 minutes. Elijah felt something in his chest tighten. Not panic, but the particular frustration of a man watching an unjust process move forward with the smooth, uninterruptible momentum of bureaucracy that has already decided its own conclusion. He asked calmly what exactly would need to happen for the review to conclude in time for him to make the flight with his son. Pruitt did not have an answer, because there was no actual review taking place, only the performance of one, built on a foundation that had started the moment a young gate agent looked at a tired-looking man in a worn flight jacket and decided, in under 5 seconds, that something about him warranted suspicion. It was at this point that Diane, apparently deciding the situation required her direct involvement, stepped into the office without waiting to be invited. "I want to be very clear," she said, addressing Pruitt while looking at Elijah, "that I have significant concerns about safety on this flight, and I don't intend to board until this is resolved to my satisfaction." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice still level, still controlled. "You saw a man in old clothes, holding his son's hand, and decided you already understood everything worth knowing. That's not a safety concern. That's a mistake you're making in front of a room full of people, including my son." Diane's expression hardened. "I've worked with this airline for 11 years, she said. "I know how these situations typically resolve, and I know what I'm looking at." Elijah asked her, directly, what she thought she was looking at. Diane did not answer honestly, because answering honestly would have required saying something she was not yet willing to say aloud in a room with witnesses. And instead, she turned back to Pruitt and said, "I'd like to see this handled properly. An instruction, rather than a request." Micah, still on his father's knee, looked up at the adults arguing above him and asked the question that would change the shape of the next 10 minutes. "Why does she get to decide if we fly, and we don't get to decide anything?" The room went quiet, in the way rooms go quiet, when a child says something too honest to comfortably ignore. Pruitt looked down at his desk. Diane's mouth opened and closed without a sound. Elijah put a hand gently on his son's back and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would improve on the question itself. It was at that exact moment that a man appeared in the doorway, a senior airport security supervisor named Ray Delgado, drawn by a call from a gate staffer who had grown uneasy watching from a distance. Delgado was in his 60s, broad through the shoulders, with a gray mustache and the settled calm of someone who had seen every version of a difficult airport morning. Delgado stepped in, took in the scene, and his eyes landed on Elijah's forearm, where the sleeve of his jacket had ridden up to reveal a small tattoo, faded with years, a trident wrapped around an anchor with jump wings behind it. Delgado went still. "Where'd you serve?" Delgado asked, his voice quieter than anything else said in that office all morning. Elijah looked up, and something in his own expression shifted too, a recognition passing between two men who understood a shared history without needing to explain it. "Naval Special Warfare," he said. "2 deployments, then 4 years training incoming operators before I got out." Delgado nodded slowly. "I did 22 years in the Marine Corps," he said. "Retired as a gunnery sergeant." He looked at Pruitt. "What exactly is the verification issue here, Gary?" he asked. Pruitt, visibly uncomfortable, mentioned an inconsistency in the booking pattern. Delgado asked to see the flag, looked at the screen for perhaps 10 seconds, and looked back up, unimpressed. "This flag triggers on same-day bookings made with cash-equivalent gift cards," he said. "That's it. Half the people flying out of this airport get flagged by this exact algorithm every week and cleared in 90 seconds. Why has this taken 25 minutes? Pruitt did not have a good answer, because there was no good answer, only the accumulated weight of small decisions that had started with Jessica's recalibration at the counter and been reinforced at every step by people who found it easier to keep pushing forward than to question whether any of it made sense. Diane, sensing the ground beneath her certainty had shifted, attempted to redirect. Regardless of the technical flag, she said, "I still have concerns about." And Delgado cut her off without raising his voice, which somehow made it land harder. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been doing this job for 11 years, and before that, I spent 2 decades keeping people alive in considerably more dangerous places than this terminal. I can tell you with complete confidence that the safety concern in this room is not the man who spent his career doing work most people will never be asked to do and would not survive if they were." Diane opened her mouth and for the first time all morning found nothing to say. The office had gone very quiet. Micah looked up at his father and asked, in a small voice, "Are we in trouble, Dad?" Elijah shook his head. "No, buddy," he said. "We were never the ones who were the problem here." Delgado looked at the clock, then at Pruitt. "This gentleman's flight board's in 6 minutes," he said. "I'd suggest you clear him immediately." Pruitt, moving with considerably more urgency than before, stamped the boarding pass and slid it back with an apology that arrived roughly 20 minutes too late to mean very much. As Elijah stood, gathering Micah in his bag, Diane made one final attempt. "I still don't think," she began. And Delgado, already turning to walk them out, said without looking back, "Ma'am, I think you've said quite enough for one morning." Diane, for perhaps the first time and longer than she could remember, chose not to push further. Word of what had happened moved through the gate area the way information always does in a crowded terminal, passed along through the accumulated whispers of people comparing notes. By the time Elijah and Micah walked back out to the boarding area, several passengers were watching him with a quiet, corrective respect, the look of people revising an assumption they hadn't realized they were making until it was taken away from them. A woman near the window caught Elijah's eye and said simply, "I'm sorry that happened to you and your boy." Elijah nodded once and kept walking. They boarded with 2 minutes to spare, and Micah, apparently deciding that the morning's drama had concluded and normal life could resume, immediately pressed his face to the window to catalog the ground crew's activity below with his usual runaway enthusiasm. Elijah settled into the seat beside him, exhaled slowly for what felt like the first time in half an hour, and allowed himself a moment of stillness before the flight attendant began the safety briefing. "Dad," Micah said, still looking out the window, "are we still going to see Grandma?" Elijah put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Yeah, buddy," he said. "Nothing about this morning changes that." Somewhere behind them, several rows back, Diane sat in her middle seat, the one she had spent the morning trying to escape, and stared out at nothing in particular with an expression that had lost most of its earlier certainty. She had spent 11 years building a professional identity around being the person in the room who understood how things worked, who read situations correctly, who never had to apologize for being right. This morning had cost her that certainty in a way she had not expected and did not yet know how to metabolize. She would think about it, on and off, for longer than she wanted to admit, turning over the specific moment she had looked at a tired man holding his son's hand and decided, without a single piece of actual information, that she already knew exactly what kind of person he was. The flight landed on schedule, and Elijah's mother was waiting at the gate in Ohio, and Micah ran the last 20 feet into her arms with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Later that night, after his mother's birthday dinner, after Micah had fallen asleep with one arm still thrown over a stuffed airplane, Elijah sat on the back porch with his mother and told her, briefly, what had happened at the airport. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Your father used to come home from that delivery route and not say a word for an hour some nights, she said. Not because nothing happened, because everything happened, and he didn't want to bring it into the house. I don't want Micah growing up thinking that's how it has to go, Elijah said. Then don't let it be, she said, taking his hand. You handled it the way you handled it, because you decided a long time ago what kind of man you wanted your son to see. That's not nothing, Elijah. That's everything. 2 days later, back home, Micah asked his father a question at the dinner table he had clearly been turning over since the airport. Dad, he said, why didn't you just tell them? Elijah knew immediately what he meant. Tell them what, buddy? He asked, though he already understood. That you were a SEAL, Micah said. That security guy figured it out, and everything changed right away. If you just told the lady, she probably would have stopped being mean. Elijah considered the question carefully. I could have told them, he said. But then the lesson they'd have learned wasn't the right one. They'd have learned they were wrong to treat me that way because of what I used to do, not because it was wrong to treat anyone that way in the first place. Micah frowned, working through it. So, it wouldn't have actually fixed anything, he said slowly. It would have just fixed it for you, Elijah said. And I want you to grow up understanding that the way people deserve to be treated doesn't depend on what they've done or who they turn out to be. It depends on the fact that they're a person standing in front of you, asking for the same basic respect everybody deserves before they've proven anything at all. Micah nodded, filing the answer away, and then asked if they could watch the airplane documentary again before bed. Elijah laughed, actually laughed, for the first time since that morning, and told him yes. He thought about the morning often in the weeks that followed, not with anger, but with a clear-eyed understanding of what it had cost and what it had taught. Diane Whitmore, he later learned, had reached out to the airline's customer relations department the following week, not to complain, but to file a formal account of her own conduct that morning, unprompted, along with a request that gate staff receive additional training on the flag that had triggered the entire incident. It was not an apology delivered to him directly, and Elijah did not need it to be. What mattered more was quieter than any public reckoning. A boy who loved airplanes more than almost anything in the world had watched his father hold his dignity steady in a room full of people determined to take it from him, and had learned, without being told, that the measure of a man was not how loudly he defended himself, but how carefully he protected the people, depending on him while doing it. Some mornings, dignity is not about being seen for who you really are. It is about staying exactly who you are, whether anyone is watching or not. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming.